Okay, thank you. Welcome to this Urban Lab this morning. This is Urban Lab number 14. It's a hybrid Urban Lab, so welcome to all the people following online the Urban Lab. So our topic this morning is the landscape dimension of gender-adapted open spaces. And for that, we have several people, several colleagues here on the stage. Let me introduce first the Urban Lab and what it's about and what is the topic of this Urban Lab. So we are talking here about the landscape dimension of the open spaces, and especially also what kind of approaches, what kind of methodologies can be used to comprehend the spaces to become more inclusive, right? And especially inclusive and climate-proof, of course, because we are in a very, well, I would say, interesting and challenging climate crisis, and how this inclusiveness and how the inclusive open spaces can contribute to this urban climate change in a positive way. So we are going to have presentations today talking about tools and talking about co-creative actions to be applied and to be implemented for a better balanced and integrated open space design. And for this, I would like to welcome here our guests. We have first we are going to have first two keynotes. From Milena Ivkovic. She's an urban planner and a placemaking expert. She's coming from Rotterdam. And Haris Piblas here. He's an urban planner and landscape designer, and he's from Zurich, Switzerland, talking on behalf of Dres Sommer, Switzerland. And our other speakers, or our other guests, we have here Steffi Schüppel. She's a landscape architect from Saxony here, and representing BDLA, the German landscape architecture organizations from Germany, and responsible for the international affairs. And our last guest is Nicholas Yu. He is a senior urban specialist representing Guangzhou Awards and urban innovation. So I would like first to have to invite Milena to the stage and deliver your keynote. Thank you, Milena. After the presentation, we will have a discussion with the other guests on the topic of landscape dimension and gender balanced open spaces. Okay, Milena, the floor is yours.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you for this kind introduction. And I would like to start immediately with my presentation. Again, thank you also to the invitation for this SDG series of urban labs and workshops today. What I'm going to talk about is about soft city or how do we make gender-sensitive public spaces. My dear colleague Didier von Kutzem has already introduced me, but just again a very short introduction about myself and my connection with gender and public spaces design. So my background is architecture and urban planning. I'm a placemaker and civic participation innovator, looking to unify people, places, and technologies. So besides doing design, I'm also a web developer for the inclusive participation tools. I'm leading Placemaking Balkans network in Belgrade, Serbia. I'm originally from that part of Europe. And recently I became board member of the Placemaking Europe Foundation, which is based in Amsterdam. So let's get immediately to the aspects of soft city and gender. First, why are we so concerned about gender-sensitive cities or gender-sensitive places, especially in the context of sustainable development goals? collected here a series of illustrations coming from UN Women, from their research. And you can see that they kind of compared the gender issues with the SDGs and tried to position what is this question of gender considering SDGs. And if you see, there is, for almost every SDG, there is a kind of level of inequality and disinclusion of women. So we can see how certain areas, especially when it comes to earning money, when it comes to finding employment and access to healthcare, has been denied, or how many women have been actually disadvantaged in these areas. So there is a lot of work to be done in this particular field. So you can understand that next to trying to achieve the SDGs in general for better urban future, we need to think also about these aspects, which show clearly that there is a large disadvantage for women in many aspects of the SDGs. I'm just going to tackle let's say, public space and urban development among these SDGs. I think that's the SDG 11, but there is also a lot of connections with SDG 13, which is a climate change adaptation. One thing that really struck me when I was making this presentation is that we need to really look beyond the buzzword of the gender equality, because gender equality, gender mainstreaming, and especially connected with spatial characteristics of our cities, it's quite a complex field. And if we add also other aspects, such as environmental, economical, or social threats that we see coming or that we have experienced in the past decades, it makes this context of gender mainstreaming in the cities even more complex. There are several things I really would like to underline here, and that's, if we look, for instance, at the position of women and what it's called the extreme heat conditions or the urban heat islands, and we know that climate is changing with increasing heat in a lot of urban areas. Usually it's women who do all the walking in the city, so walking and gender is a very important connection if we talk about how to make cities better for women. The other interesting aspect is, of course, women and age. That's also something that you can't always see when there is a talk about gender mainstreaming. Usually the accent is, on younger women or girls or, let's say, female working force. But there is this big problem, at least in Europe, with aging population and the role of the position of women in the aging population, because we know that there is a huge pension and payment gap which reflects in the old age. And somehow we need to think about the tools and the methods to soften those problems of those particular groups. Of course, women are still primarily caregivers, and they have to do it nevertheless, the conditions in the city. There is this image about the Bangkok flood in 2011, when you just have to do your daily chores, doesn't matter what the environmental disaster is happening in your city, so somehow you have to go through with it. And finally, this illustration I find very good to start a dialogue about the safety, security, and gender in public space, which is most of the time focused on providing safety and security, safe and secure places for women in public space. But there are a lot of public spaces in European and other cities that are just unsafe for everyone. And this is the image of a pedestrian bridge in Rotterdam, quite a popular one, but I was wondering, do only women feel unsafe and insecure in these kind of design solutions and constructions? Because it's really completely negating the need to be safe in public space. But, you know, it's for the sake of design, sometimes we make these kind of constructions and then we need to correct them afterwards. That's also my next point, and that is like, okay, we need to make better design and gender-aware design, and we don't want to have the bridges like I just showed. But what are we missing in this is what kind of skill we as designers are missing in this. Is it some kind of fault in the way the designers have been educated? Or maybe it's just the lack of proper data. And I believe that this is the second one is really the case when we are talking about understanding gender and public space. So there is obviously a bias in data, how the space has been used and how the space can be designed. And I warmly recommend you this book on the left side called Invisible Women, Exposing Data Bias in a World Designed for Men. This book was actually made from starting with a medical research showing the differences in how the medication are developed. All the medication is made mostly for, you know, male bodies. But the book goes really deeper and tackles a lot of other issues. Next to this, you can see this very interesting visual about trying to understand, for instance, the behavior or the use of public transport. You know, mobility is always very important for cities. There is a lot of research, a lot of data on that. But, you know, all this data has been put in a way that it's unified, anonymized, and it's just for one solution fits all, because it's an easier way of thinking about planning, an easier way of thinking about, you know, designing big systems such public transport. But luckily we see in the last couple of years there is a swift towards more granulated data that really understand who is the user. So the user is not anymore some kind of anonymous dot that travels from A to B, and we are trying to optimize the system for that. But there is a lot of understanding what the user actually do when the public transport is being used. And then you see suddenly these research graphs are becoming completely different. They start to have completely different shapes. And what is previously been just called work, like everyone is going to work, if you kind of refine the data, you see how much women are, what kind of work are women actually doing and how much transport they're using. And one of the biggest conclusions about this is that public transport has been used very intensively by women because they have so much more things to do in a day than men, right? So those are, I mean, they're just traveling much more than men. You know, men are going from A to B, and women are going to A to B to C to D to B to F. You know, they do a lot of in a day. But that's a very interesting way of thinking, but also very important because it's been now argumented with the evidence-based data. So it's not just me thinking about, you know, women are doing a lot. This is the proof that they are doing a lot, and their mobility patterns are completely different. To go a bit more into this bias in data about urban planning and design and landscaping, the next challenge we have as urban professionals is to understand even deeper the data when it comes to how men and how women are using the space. And this is just a snapshot of all the different researches going on in various European universities. And again, it's about mobility. And there is this interesting paragraph that I found it's not only the work, it's also some other restrictions that have been put upon women, such cultural, economical, physical, even psychological restrictions. And I underlined this sentence I found really, really interesting, like stating, female mobility restrictions begin at a young age, as parents tend to give their sons greater freedom to move around in city spaces than their daughters, who are perceived to more susceptible to the threat of stranger danger. So from the early age, we are kind of educating girls, or not educating, but saying public space is not safe. Take care. You know, take care where you go, take care what you do. And for the sons, it's different. Son, you can do whatever you want. You can just go. You know, that's, so I think we need to think about how these, let's say, how the education and how the mindset of girls can be set from the very early age. And if we don't have spatial solutions which can support this shift from giving equal access or equal way of thinking for boys and girls, then this is not really going to happen in reality. So we need to support this with concrete spatial solutions. And again,
ich würde auch nochmal wiederholen, die Denkweisen von Männern und Frauen, das ist aus dem Jahr 2019, die Frauen nehmen dreimal häufiger ihre Kinder in die Schule, bringen sie in die Schule als die Männer. Und wie ich schon gesagt habe, die Frauen gehen...
Okay, so there is obviously a gap. There is obviously a gap in data. There is a bias in data. We need to work on that. There is already good work started, so that's really encouraging that the academia and professional researchers are really taking care into this account and using technology to help parse this data to understand better. But there is also a strange thing, and that's, of course, the gap in professional design practice. So on one side, we are saying, okay, we want to have gender mainstreaming, good. We have technical tools to do this, great. We have technology, so we have now good data, which is not biased. But who is applying the solutions? Who is making the solutions based on this data? And this is the graph that is illustrating the state of architectural profession in the United States. So maybe it's not really applicable for Europe, but I don't think that Europe is very much different than this. So you see that at the base of this pyramid, there is a lot of women and girls doing architectural design, planning, education. So it's not the question about that we don't have enough, let's say, female or gender-aware designers. But when we come into practice, suddenly this pyramid narrows very much. And if we really look at the middle segment, it's still kind of okay. But if you look at the top segment, no one is awarded gold medal, no one is really appreciated for the design. And somehow, somewhere along this road, women just tend to opt out from the design practice or general urban planning practice. So that's also a little bit of the question, how do we stimulate women who do have education to stay in the practice? Because only just having data is not going to help if it's not really applied by women who do understand it and who do have the skill. But you know, there are no quick fixes, and I would love to have the answers to these challenges and just be very simple and say like, okay, we need more women leading architectural offices, but that's not going to help. I mean, it's not that easy. So I was trying here to summarize, let's say, what are the tasks that are upon us as planners, as designers, as also as policymakers, as government officials. And the task one is to try to neutralize this biased approach, this biased approach to that I just showed. And it means for public space, for space in general, there is a huge task to kind of retrofit the spaces that have been made from a certain point of view to make them more inclusive and more applicable for the gender mainstream. So it's a huge task because a lot of our infrastructure, a lot of our buildings are not really suited to these soft measures or the soft city data that we are now trying and we are getting them in. So it's a complex operation. It will require new design skills, but also new adaptation measures, right? So we need to have some kind of new framework saying like, hey, this is wrong, this is not anymore suitable for this particular group. But there is also a need for the strong support in new policies, right? Because you can have all the data, you can also have better designs, but if it's not supported in the legislature, then you cannot apply it, you cannot implement it. And of course, if it's not supported like that, a lot of commercial developments will just say, well, why should we do this? Why should we be sensitive to this? Because there is no framework. Well, we can do whatever we want to do. Task 2 is, of course, taking care that this new urban development, so everything that we add to the city right now as a new development, is gender responsive from the start. So one task is, okay, we need to adapt to the gender mainstreaming, but everything that we build now should be gender responsive from the start. So we should be aware about different patterns of use, we should be aware about different physiologies, should be aware about different perceptions, and let's do it from the start. And of course, to do all this, the policymakers need to have good information. I mean, the policymakers and decision makers are the ones who are actually enforcing or advocating or promoting or legalizing the whole new framework. But if they are not informed in a good way, if they don't have the access to good data and good arguments, of course they're going to say this is less relevant. So there is a lot of advocacy work next to it, to really persuade policymakers that this is the right way to do. And I think it's going to be easier because a lot of cities are aware of this issue. And as I said, technology is going to help a lot to persuade them based on the arguments. I'm going to conclude the talk with two small examples from my own practice, which is related to, let's say, gender mainstreaming and understanding the better relation between women and the city and others in the city. They're both small-scaled and they're both retrofit projects. As I said, retrofitting and adapting existing places is a huge task. The first one is a case of trying to reshape and redesign public space of a school. Actually, it's a schoolyard, but it's also shared public space with the neighborhood. And try to kind of understand how it can be, who is using it, how the girls are using it, and what are the problems? Why are they not using it, right? So I have organized, together with another office from Rotterdam, a series of workshops to understand first the needs and the problems. You can see it on the right image. And the age was between, we had two groups. One group was really young girls between, let's say, 7 and 10, and the others were like 10 to 12. So of course there are different needs between the different groups. But when you see this image on the left side, that's all the space they had there. It's just this green rubber actually football field. And they were always pushed at the edges of this field because the field is being used for boys. It's for football, you know. You don't do that. So it was kind of trying to understand how can we mix it, and a lot of new insights came to the light. And of course, we tried to make some good guidelines as the result of this interaction with the young girls, to make guidelines how to transform this generic space into something that is more inclusive for girls. I have to say the challenge that we had is that, you know, these kind of play fields that you see on the left image, those are standardized play fields, you know, by the municipality, by the city. They have their own standards. They say if the school has 200 pupils, the square should be like this or should be like that, period. You know, that's it. And I think we need to change those standards as well. It's very important to do that. Not only for girls, but also to understand that we need to make much better public spaces, which can include diversity of ages, diversity of groups, and not just try to be normative in a way, saying a school of 200 pupils has to have a field of 40 square meters, period. You know, that's really kind of not done anymore. And a final image from another case, which is much closer to what Placemaking Balkans is doing. It's of course trying to transpond these topics of gender mainstreaming into completely different contexts, right? So Eastern Europe has other challenges, and Southeastern Europe has even more challenges. And this is again a workshop about the retrofitting of the neighborhood space. And the interesting thing is, when we started this workshop with the whole community, which has something like 500 people living in mass housing buildings, the thing is, the only persons who actually showed up at the workshop were women and girls. Men were not interested, because it was almost like, oh, it's a girly stuff to do, to take care about public spaces. You know, we don't have time. We have more important things to do. So that's that's again something that it's completely that was completely unexpected. But on the other hand, if you see what is the transformative power of these, let's say, women-driven groups, then it's again a great joy to see it, because they're very good in mobilizing everyone. They're very good in, you know, calling and pressuring on the local municipality and saying, like, we need this, we have to do that. So there is, of course, all these cultural and traditional barriers that need to be bridged, or I would say we just need to understand it. And sometimes you can't even go against the flow. It's, if you want to bring change, then maybe this is the way to bring it. Then you just work exclusively with women. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope that it was inspiring enough, and I'm looking forward for your questions at the end of the presentation.
Thank you, Milena. Fantastic. That's. Thank you so much, Milena, for this very interesting and very demonstrating also the deficits and the challenges in this gender-sensitive dimension. Yeah? Especially addressing also the needs. Where are the needs? And talking about data and available data, and demonstrating there is a real need to change something and to create also better public spaces, accessible to all. So now it's time to have our second speaker here on the stage. I would like to ask Haris to bring, maybe some solutions related to gender-sensitive spaces. So welcome.
Thank you, Didier. Guten Morgen.
Good morning. I'm pleased to be back here at Mannheim, and I had the great pleasure in the recent months to be active here in the cooperation between Mannheim, Halle, Stuttgart and Hamburg, and 2 industrial partners. Also with Dresden Sommer, where I have the pleasure to be heading the solutions sector. Before that, I was at the University at Zurich in urban planning. And I will give you an overview of a summary of 5 different theses, but I'll switch back to English so that also our guest can directly get involved in the presentation. So thank you for inviting me to the city of Mannheim.
To have a final thesis what an inclusive city should be. So in this sense, I feel that these 5 theses that I'm going to share with you, if I just may have the laser pointer, thank you, is to ask questions. And I'm happy to also talk to you and hear your opinion, your feedback, your input, whether these questions that I'm asking are something that we can also use for further discussion. So if inclusive cities are technology-based, so in this sense, we all knew about the smart city discourse and about different new players, technology companies, consultancies that are entering the, I would say, the urbanistic discourse and practice. And in this sense, the question is if this is enough, because if we look into the cities and to the urban laboratories around the world, and Mannheim is a particularly interesting one, is that the challenges are more radical than maybe most of us and all of us who are operating within it. And the city as the, I would say, highest product of humankind is it does compute, as it's written here, unknown possibilities. It does conduct high-risk experimentation, and it telegraphs these unknowable futures more quickly and more completely than the raft of professionals tasked with stewardship and analysis of design. That's a thesis that we made at each of Zurich. And of course, then if we look into these Getty images and all these collages, etc., that come and tell us about the smart built environment, as a fashionable practice, or is it viable? And in this sense, if smart technology can replace human, or is human extension and human replacement the way to go? So in this sense, we have to really think of these big questions, and I know that also the city of Mannheim is doing that with this large smart city program. But you know, if you look into newspapers, into literature in the last 25 years, there's a huge also critique about that the smart cities are anti-human, and in the end they will destroy democracy. And of course we don't want to do that. I don't say that I agree with this, this I would say, definition, but in this sense, if you look into these generic cityscapes around the world where we have the future vision for a city is a collage of glass towers, of energy efficiency, ICT parks, artificial lakes, high-speed trains, etc., and all look the same and generic. So this sort of technocratic splendor and then uniform aesthetics. And then now we have to ask, is this kind of uniformity and homogenization controlled and monitored by big data? Should it be? And yeah, there's an ambiguity whether this term, smart city, means something different for different disciplines. So can we use it as if it was a campfire, as something to gather and try to figure out what it is? And in this sense, can also the smart city help us to have more evidence-based urban development? The second thesis, or the second question, is that inclusive cities are they collaborative? And I think all of us know this radical image from Sao Paulo. It's already, I think, almost 15 years old. And of course, we do not have this social polarization in Europe like there is, unfortunately, in South Africa or in different Latin American countries. But in this sense, these are the realities of urban laboratories across the world, and we do have an increasing polarization, also due to all the energy and other crises that are ongoing also in our society. So maybe this is a a kind of the most radical example, but we do have to think about social polarization if we want to have collaborative approaches. And the question is, and I think to underline what Milena said, what can we do as designers and planners? Can we be theorists and practitioners at the same time? Can we think mobility and public space also at the same time? So how kind of to take all these topics that are now also coming as different, if you want, innovation topics and pots of money of national governments, of the new European Bauhaus, but how to kind of interlink it. And the only way, and this is an image from the Reactivate Athens project that we did at the ETH Urban Think Tank, is to literally, and that's nothing new, to go and ask people. And of course, it's not this romantic process and of asking everybody and being kind to everybody. In urban development, urban transformation, Stadtweiterbau, is a kind of negotiation process, and this negotiation process, and I tell also to my students, is not a kind of Disneyland practice where everybody is going to be happy and discuss and then we come up with a consensus for the future city. It is a very difficult process that needs to be curated, that these fears and visions, etc., of the stakeholders, and that's not only the community, it's the economic players, political players, social players. They have to be synthesized, and I think this is the kind of synthesis or curation is something that maybe the future role of the architect, landscape architect, and urbanist should be. And those are just a couple of images from these city labs in different cities and difficult cities, and I'm going to come to it in a moment, like Sarajevo, etc. But here we do have to find different new modi operandi if you want. And where I see the biggest confusion happening is about the roles, who does what. And the increasing specialization and technocratization of urban development adds more layers, more processes, more Hawaii, more SCR phases, etc. And I think we have to kind of rethink these processes, entschlacken, or whatever you want to call it, and to really find ways, and this is also to add what Milena mentioned, to maybe work with urban simulation, with urban gaming, and try to demystify the roles in urban development. What's the role of the citizen representative, of the real estate developer, of the nonprofit organization, and also to bring out best practices and worst practices and good practices. We discussed it last night at dinner with Nicholas, but to bring out examples to the street, and this is an exhibition happening in public space, also to make the community aware about how a city is being transformed, because I think images can really help to demystify what's going to happen to cities. It's going to calm down people who think that we come to gentrify, to destroy, etc. And in this sense, this urban simulation game that we developed at ETH, we tested it in different, also complex situations, like in very difficult suburbs of Cape Town, where, and I'm not going to go into details, and maybe that's something for discussion, where there's different ways that we can build the city together. And in this sense, yes, there's a digital dimension, the virtual one, but I strongly believe in the physical one, that we really build the city together, we simulate. It's a kind of analog twin. It's not a digital twin. So in this sense, I think this makes it even more palpable and more real for communities and stakeholders all over the world. And those are just a couple of images of how this kind of process of negotiation has been turned into this EmpowerCheck project, also done by the Urban Think Tank and ETH, that kind of been translated, this consensus has been translated into spatial models, into implementation. And again, I'm not going to dwell on it too much, but yes, we have to also kind of quantify to understand what happened. We can use these very simple spider diagrams, etc., to understand the different layers like social cohesion, informality, functional diversity, accessibility, in order to understand what's going on. The third thesis is that inclusive cities are they sustainable? And we live in moments of pandemic, and there is the thesis that the pandemics actually spurred cities to make more green space for people, because all the cholera and all the other pandemics we had in the 19th century, Hobrecht's plan of Berlin, we know about also what happened in the mid-19th century and even earlier with Napoleon III and Baron Haussmann in Paris. So this kind of sanitarization of cities. But how, with all the loss, all the victims, all the economic, if you want, also damages that we take out from this pandemics, how can we use this also as a chance? And of course, we do have all these Natura 2000s and enough knowledge. So I don't think it's about a lack of knowledge that we have to integrate different components of green infrastructure, the green walls, the wildlife overpass, the beehives, etc. There is books that are already many years old, almost 15 years, the ecological urbanism book. But I feel there is a mismatch and there is a lack of, I would say, knowledge transfer with this kind of new phenomena, also not new, with the circular principles. And I feel, you know, if you look now into architecture and circularity, and this is the cycle of the cradle to cradle, a concept that we work with strongly with at Dresden Summer, is to, yes, different on an architectural scale. You can reuse components of buildings and reassemble it like in Lego, but what does it mean for landscapes and for public space? So is circularity can also be understood as the circulation of ecosystem services, circulation of social innovation? Can we upscale somehow the circularity beyond the individual architectural building? I don't have the answer. At IFLA, we published a position paper where we more asked questions rather than also gave answers, and I think that's an ongoing discussion that we have to continue. And there are projects from colleagues from Auto Géré, etc., who are activating, I feel already doing that, what we're kind of trying to understand through new ways of public space, urban agriculture, reusing ecosystem services in France, in also I would say socially disadvantaged and underprivileged areas. And in this sense, I think that's a question how we can also upscale that. And if you just allow me to move to Detroit, it's already an old image. You see more than 15 years old. But you know, I think it's easier to use radical examples of cities to understand what's going on. And Detroit obviously lost a kind of a huge fraction of its population after the deindustrialization. We know about the political consequences of America's deindustrialization. I don't want to, I think we all know what happened in 2016 and what happened before to maybe led to that. I'm not a political analyst, but I feel there was a change of also voting behavior in the Rust Belt. And if we talk about activating cities, we do have to understand what happens to a shrinking city. And then these dramatic images that were all over National Geographic, etc., this kind of de-densification. We talk about Verdichtung, densification of our cities in Switzerland, in Central Europe, in Germany. But what happens when this kind of symbol of American economic power de-densifies? And this is where I feel this, land that was suddenly free gave the basis, and I'm not going to simplify the version of the story, of the green and blue as the infrastructure to regenerate Detroit. Plus, all these artists, all these creatives, all the other disadvantaged population across gender, across sexual orientation, across mentality, across skin color, who kind of moved into this kind of shrank city. And in this sense, I felt this also co-initiated by the mayor Dave Bing, one of the first African-American mayors of a large American city, introducing this blue and green infrastructures as a framework for designing or revitalizing, regenerating Detroit. And I feel this is a great example how a city can be activated. And if we just move to a kind of critique to my own city where I lived for many years, Zurich, where you have these kind of conflicts between creatives and the city government and the investors, and this kind of graffiti at the Labitzke Areal in Zurich Altstetten shows that the architects and all the other designers are being seen as these gentrifiers, destroyers of, if you want, cultural, social, and microeconomic networks. And that's, I feel, should not be that way. Inclusive cities are active, or should they be active? The second last thesis. And I'm going to move into also a radical urban laboratory, city of Sarajevo, where I spent was next to Berlin, spent the most of my childhood, and also looking and now reminding what's going on in Ukraine, what goes on in Kharkiv and Mariupol and all the other cities. I think looking into this destruction that happened in Europe, it's not the Ukrainian war is not the first war in Europe after Second World War. We tend to forget tens of thousands of victims, but as urbanists and landscape architects, we need to understand such context as well. And this is an image of the kind of destroyed and reconstructed Sarajevo. This is 1996 and 2012, etc. So you have all these also symbolic and dramatic images. But for me, it was mostly interesting to look into the landscape, into the ecosystem services, and what happens if a city needs to go back to its real resources in order to survive. There's no water, so you have to work with existing water flows that were forgotten for decades. And both women and men, and you see different generations being kind of surviving or trying to survive when you have to destroy your own landscape in order to have fuel. And I don't want to know what's going to happen when the winter starts in such a cold country as Ukraine. So there is things that are going to change these cities forever. And we have to kind of think now what we could do one day when this horror is over. And looking into this modernist socialist city, like many of these outskirts of also East German cities in this sense, and you have these public spaces being transformed and as a metamorphosis of this Abstandsgrün into a landscape of survival. So I feel that's a very interesting, and maybe some of you saw the image of the Tiergarten in Berlin after 1945. It was also translated into a kind of agricultural production field. And in this sense, also women were here, and I can say it from my own personal experience, I would say the backbone of the survival strategy for the city. And you can see on these images, but now, many years after, 25 years after, the city still looks like that. Former military barracks, so the symbols of militarization, symbols of destruction, are now being abandoned, and nobody dares to touch it because it's kind of a symbol of this terrible past. And that's the question where we went and see how can this place of trauma be regenerated or turned maybe into a university campus, into a basis for the future knowledge-based society, literally. And I don't have time to dive into the project itself, but how to reactivate the city. And I feel our cities are active. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. How to amplify different human resources, ecological resources, social resources that we have in our cities. And again, I can only recommend to go and speak to stakeholders, to the activists, to the artists. And you see in the back in Sarajevo, we invited young artists who painted the future vision of the city. So it kind of very much, I would say, disadvantaged, forgotten communities that are now being uncovered, and their kind of intellectual potential and their kind of, I would say, wish to contribute to the development of the city needs to be recognized. And again, a couple of just images of, what happens if one day the front line is gone, and then we need to work again and try to bring back this traumatic no man's land into the kind of urban memory. So in this sense, we have to work also with simple ways of drawing things, because not everybody can read an GIS map, not everybody can read an AutoCAD plan. And in this sense, using this kind of cartoonish language helps for the stakeholders to understand how public space can be activated, how can a former landmine area can become a public space. And the last point, inclusive cities, should they be visionary? I mean, we did have a vision in the 20th century. I don't have to tell this to an expert audience. But yeah, maybe it was meant well, but apparently this model turned into a monofunctional, car-oriented city of the 20th century. Now we have to work to repair, maybe, or to densify, to heal. And in this sense, and that's also something that it's no, I would say, not rocket science. We obviously have to make the cities more multifunctional. We have to verticalize functions rather than just dividing horizontal functions in a city to work. I mean, the Asian cities are already doing that for many, many years and never stopped doing that. I think we have to learn from these different urban laboratories of the world. And I feel I don't have the perfect process. It's also not a sequence, but I feel understanding a place, translating these buzzwords into knowledge into strategy scenarios, and then moving into interventions could be the right thing to do in order to demystify what can be done out of a place. And of course, working with different scenarios. It's very important. So there's different options that all the involved stakeholders can choose from, and it's not an option of ABC. It's an whatever you want to call it, but it has also numbers, qualitative, quantitative data backing it up, so we can have a basis to decide what the future urban transformation could be. And if you Google it, because I don't have time to talk about everything, you can find these two publications, the Global Urban Toolbox at the City Action Lab that produced at the ETH of Zurich, one looking into urban laboratories of different continents and the one looking into Central and Eastern Europe. So having a kind of intra-European comparative study. And what we found out, and when we go to these, and that's a very short anecdote, to all this UN Forum of Mayors, when we go to all these places where people meet, you have sometimes, I feel, a way of stereotypical or cliche kind of experience that Curitiba is this South American city with this bus rapid transfer system. In Medellin, there is the cable car. In Asia, there's this and that. And what we found out in the kind of applied research model is that many cities across the world, you cannot see the world map actually, it's very pale, from Cape Town to Chinese cities, to South European cities, there's phenomena in cities that can be compared and way beyond this kind of stereotypes that we think on the first glance. And I think Mexico City obviously can learn about social housing and vice versa, what happens in Europe. Obviously, there's comparative aspects in urban informality in China and Latin America. There's obviously differences. There is a way how public spaces are being activated in Madrid, and then in Athens, and then in Cape Town. So I felt this kind of, I would say, presumption that our cities are more similar than we think, and that yesterday we talked about Benjamin Barber and the book, If Mayors Could Rule the World. I feel there is a way more that cities can learn from each other, and I feel this Urban Thinkers Campus is also based on this hypothesis, and that's why I'm very glad to be here and to hear your opinion, feedback, and inputs. Thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you, Aris, for this, for your 5 theses and also the 5 questions also related to inclusive transformation, right? And especially, I found very interesting also what you mentioned, the landscape of survival, how to survive in this. And definitely, we have a crisis in Europe, we have crisis in the world. Not only the climate crisis, we have also social crisis, but I think this is not the right presentation here. This is for this afternoon. But it's good if we have now time for questions, and especially because we have 2 other speakers or 2 other guests here on the stage. But I would like also to ask you here in this room to think about questions related to the 2 speeches before. What's about the crisis? How can we make public space, open space, a bit more inclusive? How can we make this also more attractive and social balanced, gender balanced? And I would like to first ask Steffi, for your opinion on this question. What if open spaces are discriminating, I mean, made or designed in a discriminative way? Yeah, what can you do? And maybe you can also mention some examples here from Mannheim and bring it also to the point from your experience from last night and also this morning. Maybe you have some good ideas for Mannheim and for maybe Europe. Yes.
Thank you.
Steffi?
Well, what if public spaces were discriminative? Well, I think we as planners have a big responsibility. And as Milena already pointed out, it's not, there's no particular lack in a sort of equal, there's no equal lack in equal situation for planners. There are female planners, male planners. It's a quite good mix, at least in Europe, or let's say in the western part of the world. There are other countries in which it's not the case, so this is again another situation. What I think is, or one point which came to my mind thinking about this question was also that women should also have an influence on the allocation of money, because often projects are limited by budgets. And who is often deciding on budgets? From my experience, is often men.
Oh, this is an accusation.
No, well, if you see city boards, for example, or if you see these circles of people who are deciding on that, my impression is that I don't have any statistical data about this, so I don't know. It's just it's just a thing which came to my mind, and maybe we can discuss that with also our audience. So I think this also should be kept in mind, and I think in many cities, and I think also in Mannheim, there's already an awareness that the equality for gender is an issue, and there are also resources allocated in that sense. But as I said, this is not true for all parts of the world. So I think allocating budgets for projects for a gender-responsive design is, in my opinion, a very important point.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you, Steffi. Nicholas, may I ask you also your opinion on this question?
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to agree totally with what was just said. I think a very important measure that needs to be taken is gender-sensitive budgeting and procurement. Because if we look at how a local authority works, it works through public procurement. And when I was still working with UN Habitat, we actually did a gender analysis of procurement procedures and found that they were extremely biased. Right? So I think that is part of the public administration that we still have to address. It's a hidden part, but I think it's a very important part. But I'd like to come back perhaps to one of the two themes that we have for this campus, and that is the gender aspect and the climate aspect. And over the last few years, what we did in Guangzhou was we looked very carefully at the sponge city. Those of you may not know, but it's actually a national policy directive from the central government of China that every city in China has to look at how they can become a sponge city. Now, while we were looking at the different ways in which planners, architects, designers can help make a city a sponge city, we discovered that one of the biggest problems, challenges that we're facing is what I would call single-purpose public space. All right? So if you look at how we design our public spaces, they're usually designed for one single purpose. You have a park, you have a garden, you have a playground, you have a sports field, you have the street. People forget that most of the public space is occupied by the car, right? And all of this is single purpose. And all of it is hard. Very little of it is soft, except for the parks and gardens, right? And so one of the principles that we discovered was that in order to make our cities more resilient to climate change, particularly cloud bursts, etc., one of the principles is to design multi-purpose public spaces. Now, at the same time we did a gender analysis of public spaces in Chinese cities, and lo and behold, it was the same conclusion, was that single-purpose public spaces are the most gender unfriendly. Right? So, you know, this space is designed for this purpose. You cannot use it for any other purpose. Right? Let's talk about the North American city, the famous recreational spaces, hard surfaced basketball and handball courts. Now, which mother is going to take her baby in a stroller to go to one of those places? Right? And yet they are the most common public spaces in cities like New York, Chicago, Detroit, LA. There, every 4 blocks you have a basketball and a handball court, right? And those are single purpose, and they're the most gender unfriendly spaces. So a principle came out, I think, that is now being discussed by the Urban Planning Institute of China, is that the future city, we should be designing all public spaces as multi-purpose public spaces. Mm-hmm. They will then contribute to being more socially inclusive, more gender sensitive, right? But also increase the resilience of the city. And I'd just like to end by using one example which I found quite interesting in Copenhagen, which of course everybody knows experienced a very bad case of cloudburst a few years ago. So they now have recessed playgrounds in Copenhagen. So you actually step down into the playground, right? You have at least 5 or 6 steps. In case of another cloudburst, your playground becomes a swimming pool. Very interesting, right? So that becomes really an interesting aspect of urban design, urban planning, right? And but basically that's just one example. I'll speak of other examples this afternoon, but I think, yeah, the principle is that we have to really change our mindset from single-purpose public spaces to multi-purpose, multi-user-friendly public spaces.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you. Would you like to react on that, or we move to the? Well, please react first. Yeah.
Well,
yes.
just a small reaction to this, and I think what is here mentioned also is a combination of gender inclusiveness and climate resilience. I think that's extremely important. And from the last case that I have showed you in my presentation, the purpose of our workshop was retrofitting the neighborhood public spaces for the climate adaptation. So we wanted actually to kind of make them more green together with the citizens living there. And the side effect of that particular call for workshop was that only women showed up. So the interest of women in climate change and climate action, the awareness they have that the space of their daily activities, the space where children play, is not green enough, but it's also not climate resistant enough, was amazing. We completely didn't play that card, if I can say that. We didn't openly say this is a gender mainstreaming workshop. We want to hear about women's experiences in the public space. So I think this is a very powerful combination, and it should be really the win-win situation for both of aspects, the climate action and gender mainstream.
Excellent, so combining both aspects, yes. Haris, would you like to react on that? If not?
Somebody from the audience.
Yes. No, and I just a quick survey here in the attendees, and it's very nice that we have the room is dominated by women. So that's great. So we have we can expect a lot of questions from the attendants. So I'm looking to to our guests here. You have questions?
Yeah, sure. Simple question.
Christian.
Yes.
Yes, please.
When we're talking about public places and feeling safe and a city which is diverse, I'm always thinking about the underpasses all over the world and also in Mannheim. Do you have good practice and quick response to this issue?
So, good practices and good responses.
For the safety of upgrading the safety of public spaces, or the?
Especially of underpasses.
Underpasses.
German, yeah. In Germany, you call it Unterführung, and they are dark, they are long, there's a lot of incivilities.
I can give you immediately an example of the good practice happening next month in Helsingborg, in Sweden, when Placemaking Europe is staging a workshop on retrofitting an underpass in Helsingborg, using different placemaking methods. So take a look. It's the city of Helsingborg has the whole month of smart city solutions in action. And this particular workshop is going to take account how do we transform underpasses, tunnels, etc. with the help of better light design and art together with citizens, right? So please, if you can attend that in Sweden, that would be great. If not, there is going to be extensive material afterwards. But it's happening, I think, on the 18th of June or 15th. Please check. Yeah.
Very good. So this is one reply. Oh, yes, please.
Milena explained beautifully. But in Zurich, for example, the underpasses are one of the rare places we can make noise. So underpass is a very popular public space in Zurich for young bands, for skateboard, for youth, for the discriminated, for the LGBT population, etc. So these actually are very attractive places, but I know and I still feel it's not enough color, art, light, as was mentioned, and also sound. I think sound can also. Sound installations, etc. There's different, I remember case studies from the UK and Latin America that can turn this kind of hostile and very dangerous place into something more friendly.
Steffi would like to say something?
Yeah, I'd like to add to this as well something also from my own experience, because I think an important part in this issue is also the maintenance and the public control, because often these underpasses are sort of creepy and a bit smelly places, and you don't really want to go there, especially in the night. And I think this is also a very important part. So I think the municipalities should pay a good attention, maybe a more attention than in the past, to keep these places clean and safe, because that is also adding a lot to the feeling of safety.
Mm-hmm. Yes. We have two other questions from the public here. Annette, yes, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very enlightening insights, really. I liked all the talks and also the discussion very much. And I have a question for Milena. I mean, you showed us the Lochzingle Bridge. I mean, who is responsible for this sort of design? That's my first question. And also, why is it so long-living? I mean, we could always call it resilient, you know. I mean, you said it yourself, having the data seems not enough. I mean, we have been knowing about these problems 30 years ago, and still we keep on, carry on building things which are really not for cities for the future. And yeah, it's the designers on the one hand, but what is the role of the building industry? Also, if you extend on it, because prefabricated plans are much cheaper and easy to build, and you know, so you have always an interest as well. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for your question. I have to be very, very careful answering this, because I definitely don't want to put a name blame to the design offices and that kind of stuff. It's not really discussion is not about that. This particular case is sensitive from other side as well. The Lochzingle project was made, I think, started in 2014-15, so it's quite some time ago, as the first major civic initiative experiment in the city of Rotterdam. So the city has placed several projects to a public vote. So, it was experiment in public budgeting. So you could, as a citizen, you could register and vote for the best project, and the best project will then get some budget from the city. So this particular project was voted as the best because people thought like, hey, this is, crossing the major infrastructural barriers we have in the city, very, very wide train tracks and wide streets. So it's good for walkability, it's good for everything. And the problem was, of course, when it started to get realized. I mean, the city made a lot of effort. The design office made also quite an effort. It was an experiment in participatory budgeting. But then came the standards and the restrictions. The images that I showed you is the part of the Luchtzinger bridge that goes over the tracks. And the Dutch railways said we need to protect it from people jumping on the tracks. So you need to make some kind of, you have to create safety. And unfortunately, this is the best the designers could come up with creating safety. Just, we have to, take care that people do not jump from our bridge to the tracks. So let's make let's make it 4 meters high, and let's narrow it so they cannot climb. So there is this, completely misinterpretation of what safety and security is. And now the bridge is not being used at all because people don't like it. They don't like walking on these kind of structures. But it was an experiment, so I like it as an experiment, but I think it's time that we take it down now in the city because it's not serving anymore. Yeah.
I would like to ask a question. Was it a public competition, the project? Do you know that?
It was a public competition, but it was a competition of the commons. So the citizens could give proposals, whatever they wanted for the city budget. So, of course, this one won because it was made by the professional design office. So, of course, they have this advantage when submitting these kind of projects. But there were other projects which are much more, I remembered someone was just asking money to start a children's corps in a school, So there was a variety of projects. But somehow this one really get traction because it was the crisis of the building sector in Europe in general, and people really voted for it. And
the comment by Aristotle to that, I've learned in my life that the majority is not always right.
At the end, I think the project was 4 million euros worth. So city put some serious money in that. Yeah. I'm not sure about the exact number.
Interesting case. So
it's a very interesting case. Yeah.
It shows the discrepancy between safety, public authority or public requirements, and also to make this more, transformative, include also the people.
Including also the people. So the way the project has been presented is, okay, we can now connect you. You can walk freely above the infrastructure because there is so many cars and trains. But is this the best solution, I'm against any elevated street. Street is a street and it has to have an eye level, has to have a face. And every elevated construction is really not good for the pedestrian. You can make it green, you can really do whatever, but if it's elevated, it's still very difficult for pedestrians. Just imagine someone in a wheelchair trying to get there.
By the way, we have similar examples also in Germany. Yeah, also. We have some more questions over there, but... No, that's fine. I think, but ladies first, sorry. Here we have another one, yes.
You can pose it in German as well, because we have...
Oh, yes.
Don't be afraid of English.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentations. During Hera's presentation, I was thinking about, does the change of city planning always need to come with a crisis? Because it's a little bit, you pointed out very good examples, but they had a history which was always a little bit sad. And is the same big change possible in cities which are working like normal, or where no crises have been,
Thank you.
I would hope so. I mean, if you look into the documentaries, and it's a radical example, this air crash investigation, the change of kind of rules in aviation is being done mostly after a terrible crash. So unfortunately, we did have the means of digitalization also before Corona. But Zoom and Teams and all these things and co-working and working from home was not the rule. So it needs a push, apparently. The European Union is now just providing, I don't know how many hundreds of millions billions of euros to get independent from fossil fuels coming from a particular part of Europe. So I think the practice proves us wrong. But I also do hope that urban practices can be done also in stable circumstances. But if you look into all these things, and I must note that here, participation, city labs, workshops, that's not being asked in most cases where I work. Nobody's paying for that, for urban lab that stays for 6 months in Athens. There's not part of the formal urban planning process. So we have to invent it, the rules. So if you participate in the usual kind of landscape architecture competition, you know, most of colleagues, and that's how we've been doing in the last decades. Then you go back to your atelier, your studio, your office, and do it yourself with your little team of interns and I don't know what. And kind of to take this process out, it needs to be rethought. And I feel in Germany it happens with this big innovation projects from BME, BMBF, and now this European Bauhaus funding is kind of disrupting, if you want, the urban development, urban transformation processes. And I feel and I hope that this is also going to continue like that, because all of these things that we show, they're not part of it's very difficult to do them because they're not formal, most of the cases. So we do sometimes illegal things just to make it happen.
It's good. So humanity needs crisis, yeah, to move forward. Nicholas, you wanted to say something on that?
Yes, well, I think our cities are already in a crisis. I think COVID showed just how much of a crisis our cities have become, right? They have, my analysis of 29 cities affected by COVID over the last 2.5 years has shown that, first of all, we had real bad cases of inequality, right? COVID showed how unequal our cities really are, right? It was the most vulnerable, the poorest neighborhoods that suffered the most. So that was number one. Our cities are very unequal. Now, that's not necessarily a planner's fault, but it is a governance issue, is that we have allowed those cities to become unequal. Another aspect is that we were totally unprepared for disruptions to the supply chain. Right? So we had cities that suffered from lack of food, from lack of essentials. Right? The whole city was not, we've privatized all of the logistics of the city. The city administration is no longer in charge of logistics. And when push came to shove, the private sector failed us. So we have to rethink that again, is another key lesson. And the third one is that, yes, we have not been asking people what they need for a very, very long time. And this comes back to our public space issue, is that we found that most of our public spaces were unusable during the pandemic, that they were not fit for purpose, right? That it was not user-friendly, that you couldn't just go out for half an hour and enjoy your public space for half an hour. So I think, yes, our cities are in a crisis. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to recognize what happened during COVID, what happened during the pandemic, and to ask ourselves seriously what needs to change. I have one example which I think is quite interesting, is that the province of Hebei in China, where Beijing is located, launched a design competition for a pandemic-proof city. And it was a Spanish architect who won the competition. And it was quite amazing, the design principles that he used in his city, because in China, when we build a new neighborhood, it's for 200,000 people. It's not for 2,000 people. So it was the scale of a city, a sizable city in Europe. And for example, all single room apartments were only facing south, right? All other apartments had to have most of the rooms facing south, so that nobody is stuck in a lockdown situation with no sunlight coming into their living space. All the public spaces were multi-purpose, where you could have a walk, you could take your your baby for a stroll, you could go jogging or whatever, was also the space where you grew vegetables. So you had hanging gardens, a bok choy, hanging all over the place, and the recreational space was underneath your hanging gardens, right? So all of these design principles show perhaps, this was pushed to the extreme, but it illustrated that we have allowed our cities to become fragile, we have allowed our cities to become unequal, and the way we've governed our cities, we've put ourselves even more vulnerable because of the outrageous privatization of public services.
Thank you, Nicholas. We have a question here from the back. Can you present yourself and then? Yeah.
Thank you very much for all the good inputs and the discussion. My name is Sören Landmann and I'm the LGBTI Commissioner of the City of Mannheim. I wanted to add my perspective that when we take the vision of the SDGs seriously, that no one should be left behind, then it's important to not only work together with the people that are already interested and engaged, but also to ask ourselves who's not participating at the moment, who's not in the room, who's not sitting at the table, and why. And just giving you a quick example, I was just recently participating in a participatory process of redesigning an urban space, and there were results presented when people using the space were asked what they want, what they need, and there was the result that the people presenting the results said, yeah, people using it have no problems with security and safety. And I was not surprised because the people that have a problem with security are not using the space now. So this is, I think we really have to rethink our process and whose perspectives are not presented right now, and to include more really vulnerable groups that are the ones, because as our mayor once said, as far as I remember, if a city is safe for under 8 and over 80, then it's quite fine for all the others. And I think you can add many other things. If it's safe for people with disabilities or people that are queer youth or whatever, then it's also quite a good place maybe, and for many others. So just my comment.
Is a comment, or would you like to have a reply also from the, or maybe you can also.
I mean, the question would be maybe if these perspectives are really relevant in the discussion of your networks and perspectives. I mean, I heard about it that you think of that, but is it really also the people that are in power taking this seriously, or is it then again companies that are important, that their perspective that is more important than of young people, for example?
Okay, thank you. Who would like to? Yes.
I'll try to rephrase your question. So your question is, how do you play with a power structure, let's say, to have more underrepresented voices come to say something about their situation, not just the people in power, as you say, right? Okay. It's always been, for myself, working already more than 10 years in civic participation, using all kinds of placemaking tools, but also kind of other communication tools. It's always been a challenge how to really reach out to the people for whom we are, let's say, designing the space, or for whom we are making decisions as policymakers. And it's not, again, it's not easy. You know, sometimes the reasons are very banal, I have to say. You know, even when a municipality organizes some kind of, community consultation or whatever, it's just organized on a wrong day. People work, it's not that they have, it's not their job to sit here and discuss discuss gender issues or whatever. So sometimes those reasons are really banal, and you need to understand the dynamics of urban life and the dynamics of the neighborhood you would like to reach out to really show that you appreciate their time. It's really crucial. And that's already a big step. And of course, there has always been several times already said, it's what kind of channel of communication we're using. Is it just a very boring letter from the municipality to give opinion, which is in 90% the case? I mean, in Rotterdam, that's the case. You just get a letter, you need to fill it in. Or what are the new ways of doing it? And when it comes to action on the ground, if you really want to increase the reach out, I think that bureaucracy needs to be creative a bit, and sometimes you just need to have a mobile office in the neighborhood, you know, just be present on the ground, because people are not going to come to these kind of spaces. They're intimidated by this. They don't feel stimulated to speak up about certain issues. And sometimes if you just send out a letter, it's always quite anonymous, so what is the value of the data that you collect if everyone can just hide behind anonymity? So I think that, you know, a city needs to be creative in a way of trying to reach out people.
Mm-hmm. There are very good examples of so-called Quartiersbeauftragte, so people responsible for their quarters. Steffi? Yes.
I would like to, I totally agree to this. I would like to add that I think it's also important to involve these groups which we think that they are underrepresented also on eye level. And I'm in particular thinking also about people in the city, in the quarter with a migration background. And I think there also the cultural issues are a very important matter. So and we are discussing that also at the moment in a specific project, and we came to the idea that when it's about planning issues and trying to involve these groups which are underrepresented, maybe we can also find on the side of the planners or on the side of the municipality people which have a similar cultural background or a similar life experience, which can then approach these people to speak with them and to collect their opinions and to, you know, start the conversation really on eye level and not coming like the planner, even with the best intention for the participatory process, but like coming from above or from another kind of context to ask these questions. I think it helps to create also this, face-to-face relationship and empathy at this point.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And also,
yes, that's a very important question. That's why I would like to dwell on it. Yes, in usually you have all these usual suspects, a strong NGO who always shows up, and they're of course angry if you don't invite them. But it's exactly what you said. It's how to reach this invisible people, the disadvantaged, this privileged. And if I may be very concrete, I mean, you saw maybe this image from Sarajevo. So there's not Art Basel or an art market for young art students who are, many of them at the same time, kind of performance artists, LGBT activists, etc. So in this sense, to kind of amplify this resource and invite them, this was a great challenge, but you have to know the place. You cannot be just a parachuter flying in and expecting that you will have everybody on board. Mm-hmm. So it's the process of inviting the right organizations and people and being really persistent in bringing them on board. And this kind of vision that the artists and activists drew of the city, this was maybe the most valuable product of this kind of project activities. And the same is in Switzerland and Germany. And for German standards, I have a migration background. So I know how it is to be in these kind of societies that just want to be left alone. You know, they're being, had a so-called status that was called Duldung. So these people are afraid of the authorities. They don't want to participate. They hate going to the Amt. You know, you have for many years been kind of sent angry letters and Abschiebung, Ausschaffung, and all these terrible words. So they do not want to be. They just want to be left alone. Many of them political refugees, afraid to be kind of, whatever, Croatians and whatever, who are now afraid to being arrested and brought back. So they are, it's very difficult to bring these people on board. But that's the challenge. And when we did that in Switzerland, in one of the most, the community with the highest migration background of all of Switzerland, Emmenbrücke, if you Google it, more than 60% officially, not to talk about the people who have the Swiss passport. when we did the first round of the workshop, I didn't show this project, but and our client, the quartiers manager, he did a great work because he did a couple of round emails, and then the usual suspects came back. The angry people from the Quartiersverein, the developer, the Elektrizitätswerke, etc. And then we looked at the list, and I'll be very, very kind of explicit. I didn't see any Yashari name, any Jovanovic, any Nguyen, any Menendez. These people were missing. And we refused to do the workshop, the participant workshop, until we had them on board. And took another couple of months to go to the Albanian Islamic Verein, to go to whatever, all these kind of little communities and bring them on board. So it's a long-term process, and you have to really be persistent. And, you know, talking about gender, I mean, in Switzerland, we all know when women receive the voting right, very, very late. So in this sense, we still have a lot to learn, and we do live in free and democratic societies, but there is a tradition of I would say, unfairness that need to be now repaired, and the only way is to really make these people feel welcome in the processes.
Can I add a little last sentence? Yesterday in my lab, when we were talking about queers, it was also coming up that they like to participate, but they also see the problem that they are invited to many, many occasions where they should give input, and they feel like used, but it's not that people using this information are, I mean, they say we get pizza for it, but it's not how we survive. So it's really looking into how disadvantaged are the people, why are they not participating? Maybe they are really struggling in finding food or shelter or anything like that. So it's really very basic, and we're maybe very privileged to not recognizing this.
One sentence, I feel offering co-creation is better than offering pizza and Coke. To offer processes that inclusive, it's I feel a better option. You know, but thank you a lot for your experience.
I have to say something, because you are all the time talking. No, but I think the approach could be to bring this dimension from the public space. So, for example, we have very good examples of people feeling responsible for public space or a small piece of grass, you know, and make these people responsible for this very small pocket parks, etc., brings the whole dimension of identity, inclusiveness, right? And it can be very, very small pieces, you know, and not asking always the municipality to take care of the public space, but ask the people to feel responsible for that. Very good examples of small public parks where suddenly the community is saying, well, I feel responsible for the safety, feel responsible to have the spaces clean, etc. And it makes also the whole dimension of engagement. So, your question?
I don't want to belabor this, but I do want to mention something that we've done in the city of Los Angeles. So we have a housing crisis all over California, but in particular Los Angeles. And so to better understand kind of the antecedents to housing precarity, we piloted a process and did a study to better understand what contributes to housing precarity and what makes someone more likely to fall into homelessness. And we used a community-centered research design. And some of I think the key takeaways for me, because the goal was to be community-centered, less extractive, less colonial practices. And so all participants were compensated for their time financially. And then after they had initial findings, they went back to the participants and said, okay, did we get this right? What maybe was mischaracterized? And in doing so, I think that gave a lot of ownership over the knowledge creation to the folks who provided that data in the first place. And then kind of marginally related, before I started working for the city of Los Angeles, I worked in gang violence prevention in Chicago. And to get the information that we needed, it was incredibly difficult to infiltrate some of these gang structures. And so the city had to rely on actors and sources that perhaps were non-traditional. So they had to go into and identify who were the to understand how we serve these communities, they had to identify who are the influential people in those communities, and often those were people with very long criminal rap sheets themselves, who the city would not normally engage with in that way, but by getting their buy-in, they were able then to access the communities that they needed to access to address these really complex social problems. So kind of non-traditional methods there.
Excellent, thank you. Do we have more questions from? Yes, please. Yes, please push.
Okay. I'm thinking if I pose it in German or English, I'm not sure. I'm just wondering, planning processes are getting more and more complex, at least as far as what I hear from architects and planners in Germany. So there's a lot of rechtliche Fragen,
legal issues.
So I'm just wondering, do you have like any tips or tricks how to keep people into these processes when they take such a long time, and especially in areas, city areas, where there is not so much money spent usually?
Mm-hmm. Interesting question. So related to money.
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. How do you keep people engaged in processes without doing much as a municipality? It's also a thing. I would like to kind of talk a little bit about the scale of participation. What is the participation about? Because I think we need to be honest about what and to what extent civic participation has effect, and what is the line, or what is, let's say, the area when only experts are actually valuable for planning. I always like to cite the mayor of Rotterdam, who said, like, okay, I cannot ask everyone in this city whether the new airport is good or bad, whether the location is good or bad, or, those are really, really complex processes. And it's also unfair to ask from everyone, what do you think about, the financial consequences of the new airport for the region? Well, But so we need to be really practical and honest and say, like, okay, what are the areas, what are the scales that the civic participation has the biggest impact? Because everything that it's above that, or a scale they cannot comprehend in a good way, that becomes complex, the impact becomes watered, and then it becomes also a political question. And when it's a political question, then it's open to political process, and we know how this can end. Somehow then you're completely lost in this. So my tip and trick would be, from the professional point of view, is just be always aware about the scale when you're doing this participatory process, because it will define the impact, and people will get attached to something that has impact on their daily lives. So I think that's very important. Start from that. And of course, we live in a society in the West of Europe when you want to have a broad discussion, and you want to have a broad dialogue, and that's great, but that's a political process. If we're talking about, let's say, neighborhood improvements or smaller city scale improvements, then it's good to have civic participation in a very concrete way.
Good. Yes, Nicholas, please.
I think also in relation to the previous question, I think that we have to go beyond the concept of participation and really begin to talk about engagement. And engagement, the definition might seem small or thin, but I don't think it is. I think one of the most powerful tools that I've come across, and it's already been mentioned, is the participatory budget. Right. So if you give people of a neighborhood or a certain community the power to decide on usually relatively small amounts of money, right? I'm thinking of the case of Boston, where over 3 different mayors, they have continued using the participatory budget to engage youth at risk. This is a very difficult group to work with. These are young people who belong to gangs, right? they're really at risk. They're at risk of prostitution, of drugs, of violent crime. And yet, Boston has been successful in engaging tens of thousands of youth on deciding on $1 million a year. And what is amazing is that the number of youth who then go back to school, or the number of youth who then, because what happens is that youth drop out of school because they lose self-esteem along at some point in their itinerary. And by giving them a true responsibility of decision-making, they re-find part of that self-esteem and become much better adults. So I think, it's a very powerful tool, and I don't think municipalities should be wary of using it. It's not a big part of your capital expenditure budget, but it really gets people moving and gets people engaged because they really get to decide what they're going to do with a very small part of your CapEx budget.
Do we have for example, solutions where we have cities changing also the rules and changing also the policies they have? So they, simply changing the whole context of policies, inclusive with the trying to include also people in a better way. Do you have examples for that? Yes.
I think it's right next door. It's in Vienna.
Vienna.
Vienna has been doing quite a bit to include minority groups, recent refugees, immigrants into their. First of all, the municipality can communicate with people in 18 languages.
18.
And I think that is very important. If you don't even communicate in the language of the minorities you're trying to reach out, then you've already lost half of the battle, right? But all the documentation in Vienna, the welfare office, the housing office, the educational office has literature in 18 different languages and have people who speak 18 different languages, right? So I think that is very important. And they also went through a youth planning exercise, not a participation exercise, a youth planning exercise, where the ideas of the youth were actually incorporated into the future plans of the city of Vienna. So, yeah, we do have examples.
There's a question. There's a question.
Sorry, Olitza?
Hi. Thank you very much for all the discussion so far. And it's been really enlightening to hear from, especially this part of the globe, and some of the examples. I think one of the other things that, I totally agree with a lot of the points, for us has always been the challenge, the first challenge has always been the provision, making it happen, having those spaces, and probably this is where, the investments that go into public spaces, parks, For us, it's expected that the government makes these investments. Of course, over the time now in city of Kuala Lumpur, there is a lot of notion for us to actually set up a public fund to look at how funding can actually be gathered from the public for the purpose of provision of these spaces. There's a lot of court cases which we have never seen before in the past. People just protecting green areas and spaces, but there's no money for us to defend these spaces. So that is, I'm not sure whether, there's a lot of cases on this side, but that's something that's very challenging for us. Even though we have a policy for provision of green, even for private sector, which is having to give 10% of any undeveloped land that they intend to develop. However, we have public spaces which are being de-gazetted into private development, and this has been very challenging for us, so probably some insights on that would be good. On the second part is, of course, talking about the space itself, and this is where I think a lot of the discussion on the design, the form, the function, and gender lenses coming into the whole design of the space, I couldn't agree more. And this is a discussion on the Asian side is very lacking, we don't speak about that so much because park, especially in Malaysia, park is not our lifestyle in the past, because we were very fortunate to have parks as part of our playground, in our villages, But today we all live in cities, and it's getting denser, and suddenly these public spaces becomes important. But still, the function of the parks are more family-oriented, as compared to here in the European side. For us, it's very family-oriented, and when it comes to really looking at the design for these spaces, I think there is no real one design that fits every space, that has to be planned for, because it needs to go in with the social, cultural of the neighborhood or the city itself. And this is where even for us, we find that we tend to have a habit of replicating our designs, and this is where some spaces becomes less functional, less usable, less relatable to the community that it is serving. So I think that is the second challenge and important thing that is not less discussed in our part of the world. But I would like to also just put a point on, we talk a lot about public participation, engagement, but I think the point on empowerment is important, and this is what Nicholas was trying to say. So we're starting to test this, and in Penang, Didier was asking for a case study. So we have a state of Penang. We have a lot of, this is like over generations, a few decades, where the people have learned to speak up because they understand what are their rights. It became because that particular city have a lot of NGOs. I think this helps because once the people know of their rights, they are not only participating, and Millennium's point of having more women participating, it used to be like that. It used to be any kind of engagement that you do, it's only the mothers, the woman that attends this session, because they feel that it's important for them to be part of the space that you are determining, But over time, when a lot of these voices becomes more louder, I think people come forward even more so, and today this is one state that you dare not do things differently because you'll be challenged right to the very end, they'll bring you all the way to the courts. And we have seen the city council losing a lot of cases, which is something does not happen in a Malaysian society where we generally follow the law, we do not go against the law. So this is a new thing that's happening, and I think once the people understand these rights and how empowered they are to speak up, I think that's when even a simple ever public space design needs and functionality, I think becomes much more relevant. And this is the only state which have embraced gender responsive participatory budgeting as a process, not only as a social process, but actually is already inside the governance for the city council. I mentioned this yesterday actually in my session, but I wanted to say is that a lot of the public spaces projects now are using this model. And what we are saying is that the city council now feels that the people are with them, the budgets are less mismatched, and they are saving a lot more because some of the projects are contractly farmed out to the community, because the community actually can do a lot in gardening, they helping to take care for a small sum that goes to the residents association. So being empowered, I think, could be one of the other important values that needs to come into the process, because engagement was something that people like what was mentioned just now, people just stop coming if they feel that we are asking the same questions again and again. They want to know what their role are, they want to know that they can participate, and they also want to know that how can the funds be shared with them as well. So that's the small experience we have in Penang.
Thank you, Aritza, for this experience, sharing this experience in Penang. It's time now to conclude this lab. We have more time this afternoon also to talk about. I would like to ask the panelists to give us one sentence. Your recommendation when we are talking about gender-adapted open space, one sentence, please. And then we close the session. And we have a short lunch. Steffi. Steffi. Because okay.
Well, without having had the chance to think about it much.
Yeah, that's always the best.
I think it's important really to be aware of who are the groups which are underrepresented and try to get really in touch with them on eye level. I think this is my conclusion.
Excellent. Very good. Milena, you have 2 seconds.
Yeah, it goes more or less in the same line, and the recommendation is to take those groups also seriously, really, because that's their input is valuable, and at the moment they feel that the input is not valuable or not taken into account, the whole process will actually decrease and kind of stop. So take the participants seriously, that would be...
Seriously.
Yeah.
Harris.
I would say build back better. After all this crisis, we have to, I hope that the kind of new vision for cities that's not going to be based on Ausnutzungstiefe, Bruttogeschossfläche, and all these kind of technocratic things, that we have to think about ownership, to have to think about content. And I feel and I hope that this is going to be that way, and this crisis, and I have to close with that, is going to be a chance.
Very good. Nicholas?
Yes, just think multi-dimensional, no more single-purpose public spaces, right? Let's make the city what it once was, where all the spaces were multi-purpose, multi-use, and user-friendly.
Thank you so much. And now it's time to conclude this Open Lab. And thank you so much for your very active participation, your questions. And as I'm telling you, so we are going to meet again in the afternoon, the same place, and on another topic. But I hope we are going also to keep very engaged also in a discussion. Thank you. See you later.